Parents skipped husband's funeral for golden child sister's CPA party, then demanded inheritance. Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? Like no matter what you did, it was never enough? That's how I felt my entire life, growing up with my younger sister, Clara. And it took my husband's death, and my parents' unbelievable reaction, for me to finally break free. Buckle up, because this is a story about betrayal, greed, and the true meaning of family. My name is Sarah, and for the past 3 years, I've been watching my husband, Liam, battle a rare form of liver cancer. When we first received the diagnosis, I felt like the world had stopped spinning. Liam was only 42, a vibrant, successful architect, and we had a beautiful 7-year-old daughter, Olivia. We were supposed to have a lifetime ahead of us, filled with laughter, travel, and watching Olivia grow up. The one silver lining in this horrific situation was Liam's foresight. He'd always been incredibly responsible, and his financial planning meant we could afford the very best medical care. We traveled across the country, consulting with top specialists, participating in experimental trials. We left no stone unturned. But as the months turned into years, it became agonizingly clear that we were fighting a losing battle. All the treatments were merely delaying the inevitable. Through it all, Liam's parents, Susan and George, were our absolute anchors. They lived just a 15-minute drive away and were constantly present, offering unwavering support. "Sarah, let us pick up Olivia from school today," Susan would say on days when Liam had particularly grueling treatments. "And don't even think about cooking dinner. I've made a huge pot of chicken soup." Olivia, bless her heart, tried to be brave, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. At bedtime, she'd often cling to me, her voice small and shaky. "Mommy, when will Daddy get better?" she'd ask. I never knew what to say. How do you explain to a child that their hero is slipping away? I'd just hug her tight and whisper, "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetheart." My own parents, on the other hand. Well, let's just say they were a different breed. My mother, Patricia, and my father, Richard, lived just as close as Liam's parents, but their involvement in our lives was minimal, to put it mildly. It was always about Clara. My perfect, accomplished, golden child sister, Clara. "Mom, could you possibly watch Olivia for a few hours? Liam had a bad reaction to the chemo, and Susan has a dentist appointment." I'd ask, my voice laced with desperation. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry, but we promised to help Clara with her her pottery class today," Patricia would say, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. You know how Clara gets when she's stressed about her creations. It was always something with Clara. Her pottery class. Her book club. Her yoga retreat. Her existential crisis. My needs, my family's needs, always came second. It had been that way my entire life. When I was 8, my parents missed my school Christmas concert because Clara had a slight cough. When I graduated high school, they left immediately after the ceremony to attend Clara's, wait for it, amateur salsa dancing competition. She came in third. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to it, to the point of numbness. Liam and his parents became my real family. Susan and George treated me like the daughter they never had, showering me with love and support that I'd never received from my own parents. So, when Liam's condition took a sharp downturn last fall, I braced myself for the inevitable, surrounded by the family who had chosen me, not the one I was born into. The night Liam died, I was holding his hand. His breathing had become shallow and labored hours earlier, and the hospice nurse had gently warned me that it wouldn't be long. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "take care of Olivia. You're the strongest woman I know." Those were his last words. I sat there for hours, numb with grief, clutching his hand as it grew cold. I couldn't comprehend that my partner of 15 years, the love of my life, was gone. Susan and George arrived at the hospital within an hour of my call, their faces mirroring my own devastation. "We're here, sweetheart," Susan said, enveloping me in a hug. "We'll always be here for you and Olivia." That night, I sent a text message to my mother, "Liam passed away tonight." Her response arrived an hour later, "So sad." 2 words. No phone call. No offer to come over. No question about how Olivia and I were coping. Just, "So sad." But I was too numb to even feel the sting of their indifference. There was a funeral to plan, a daughter to comfort, and a life to somehow rebuild. The days following Liam's death were a blur of arrangements, paperwork, and heartbreaking conversations with Olivia, trying to explain that Daddy wasn't coming home. Susan and George were there every step of the way, handling phone calls when I couldn't speak, and patiently answering Olivia's endless questions when I was emotionally drained. The day before the funeral, I was drowning in a sea of details. The funeral home needed final decisions on the music, distant relatives were calling for directions, and I still needed to pick up Olivia's suit. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since Liam died. I was running on fumes and sheer willpower. I need to ask my parents to watch Olivia, I told Susan as we sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by sympathy cards. You and George are already doing so much. I drove Olivia to my parents' house, rehearsing what I would say. My mother opened the door, already wearing her coat and holding her purse. Sarah, this really isn't a good time, she said, not even inviting us inside. We're just heading out. Mom, please, I begged, my voice cracking. It's just for a few hours. I have to finalize everything for the funeral. And we've had these plans for weeks, my father interjected, appearing behind my mother. We can't cancel now. It's Clara's CPA exam celebration. We're taking her and her study group out for dinner. Before I could even process what they were saying, they both stepped outside, locking the door behind them. We really must go, my mother said firmly. I'm sure you can find someone else. They hurried to their car, without so much as a goodbye to Olivia, who stood there, bewildered and hurt. Once they were gone, I called my friend, Emily, who immediately agreed to watch Olivia. After dropping Olivia off at Emily's, a wave of anger and curiosity washed over me. I decided to take a detour past my parents' house on my way home. The lights were on, and Clara's ridiculously bright yellow Mini Cooper was parked in the driveway. So that was the important celebration. They weren't busy, they simply preferred celebrating Clara's accomplishment, an accomplishment, I might add, that Liam had significantly contributed to, over supporting me and their granddaughter during the most devastating time of our lives. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Of course, I muttered to myself. That evening, I sent a message to our family WhatsApp group, Liam's funeral is at 10 a.m. on Friday at Oakwood Chapel. A small reception will follow. I watched as the read receipts appeared next to my parents' and Clara's names. No one replied. The night before the funeral, anxiety and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd show up, compelled me to call my mother directly. Mom, you saw my message about the funeral tomorrow, right? It starts at 10. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry, but we won't be able to make it. Clara booked a private room at the Gilded Lily to celebrate her passing the CPA exam. It's at 11, and we've already RSVP'd. I nearly dropped the phone. Mom, this is Liam's funeral, I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. We're talking about Liam, who helped pay for your new roof 5 years ago when that storm hit. Liam, who's been part of our family for 15 years. That was a long time ago, Sarah, my mother replied coldly. We need to focus on the living, not the dead. Clara needs our support right now. Before I could respond, she hung up. I immediately dialed Clara's number, my hand shaking with rage. Hey, she answered, sounding annoyed that I'd interrupted her evening. Clara, Mom says you're having a party tomorrow at the same time as Liam's funeral. Can't you reschedule it, or at least start later, so they can attend the service first? Absolutely not, she scoffed. I can't change the reservation now. Everyone's already confirmed, and this is a huge deal for me. It's not like I can reschedule a funeral thingy. A funeral thingy? I repeated, my voice rising in pitch. My husband is dead, Clara. The man who helped pay for your ridiculously expensive accounting degree. That was ages ago, she dismissed. Look, my CPA is more important than some funeral. People die every day. Then she hung up, too. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still in hand, utterly stunned. As if to twist the knife further, my phone pinged with a message from my mother. Stop harassing your sister. Her celebration is more important than a funeral. She's worked hard for this. The day of Liam's funeral dawned bright and clear, a cruel mockery of the darkness I felt inside. The service was beautiful in its simplicity. Liam had never been one for ostentatious displays, and the modest chapel was filled with people who had genuinely cared for him, colleagues, friends, neighbors, and his family. During the eulogy, I spoke about Liam's generosity, his kindness, and his unwavering devotion to Olivia. Olivia sat between Susan and George, who held her hands tightly as tears streamed down her face. After the service, several people approached me, offering condolences and asking about my parents' absence. I was surprised not to see your folks, Liam's college roommate, Mark, ironically, said. Are they unwell? They had a prior commitment, I replied stiffly, not wanting to elaborate. Susan noticed my discomfort and gracefully steered the conversation elsewhere. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by sympathy cards and flower arrangements. The house felt unbearably empty without Liam. The silence was deafening. My phone buzzed with a text message from Clara. Hope the funeral went okay. Mom posted pics from my party. Officially a CPA. Hashtag certified public accountant. Hashtag goals. No condolences. No acknowledgement of my loss. Just a self-congratulatory celebration of her accomplishment, complete with celebratory emojis. I turned off my phone without responding and went upstairs to check on Olivia. She was sleeping soundly, clutching the stuffed lion Liam had given her on her last birthday. I crawled into bed beside her, finding a small measure of comfort in the steady rhythm of her breathing. For the next week, I moved through life in a fog of grief and exhaustion. Susan and George came by every day, bringing food, taking Olivia to the park, and helping me sort through Liam's belongings. My parents didn't call. Not once. Not to check on their granddaughter, not to see how I was coping. Nothing. A week after the funeral, I received a call from Liam's lawyer, Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Walker, it's time to discuss Liam's will, he explained. He was quite thorough in his preparations. Would tomorrow afternoon work for the reading? I agreed and then called Susan and George to invite them. They were named in the will, of course, and Liam would have wanted them there. The next day, Mr. Henderson arrived at our house at precisely 2 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a somber expression that softened when he saw Olivia. Your father spoke of you often, he told her, shaking her small hand formally. He was very proud of you. We all settled in the living room, me, Olivia, Susan, and George, prepared for what I expected to be a straightforward reading. Liam and I had discussed his wishes extensively during his illness, so there shouldn't have been any surprises. But just as Mr. Henderson was about to begin, the doorbell rang. Are you expecting anyone else? Susan asked, looking confused. No, I replied, equally puzzled. As I went to answer the door, I almost slammed it shut when I saw my parents and Clara standing on the porch, all wearing expressions of exaggerated sympathy. What are you doing here? I asked bluntly. We heard about the reading, my mother said, trying to peer past me into the house. Liam wasn't a stranger, you know. We have a right to be here. A right? I repeated incredulously. You couldn't be bothered to come to his funeral, but you have a right to be at his will reading? My father cleared his throat. Now, Sarah, there's no need to be dramatic. We're here to support you. Support me? I laughed bitterly. That's rich. But before I could shut the door, my mother gently pushed past me, with my father and Clara following close behind. We're family, she said firmly, as if that explained everything. I stood there, stunned by their audacity, as they made their way into the living room. Susan and George's faces darkened when they saw who had arrived. What are they doing here? George whispered when I returned. I have no idea, I replied, my hand trembling with anger. But I'm not going to cause a scene in front of Olivia. Mr. Henderson, ever the professional, merely raised an eyebrow before continuing. Shall we proceed with the reading of the will? My parents and Clara sat on the couch opposite Susan and George, with Olivia beside me in an armchair. The tension in the room was palpable. I, Liam Alexander Walker, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament, Mr. Henderson began, reading from the formal document. Liam had left everything meticulously organized. To his parents, he left $250,000, enough to ensure their comfortable retirement and to thank them for their unwavering support throughout our marriage and his illness. We never expected. Susan began, her voice breaking, as George held her hand tightly. Then came the main provisions. To me, he left our house, 3 investment properties in the city center that I hadn't even known he owned, and $500,000 in liquid assets. The investment properties generate substantial rental income, Mr. Henderson explained. Liam purchased them over the past 5 years as part of his long-term financial plan. I sat there, stunned by the extent of Liam's foresight. He'd ensured that Olivia and I would be financially secure, no matter what. As Mr. Henderson continued reading, I noticed my mother's expression change from feigned sympathy to undisguised interest. Clara sat up straighter, suddenly paying close attention. When the lawyer finished, my mother clapped her hands together. Well, this is wonderful news, isn't it, Sarah? You're quite well off now. The room fell silent. Susan and George stared at her in disbelief. I mean, my mother continued, oblivious to the tension, with 3 investment properties and all that money, you can certainly help out family, now. Clara has been struggling to save up for a down payment on a condo, haven't you, dear? Clara nodded eagerly. It's so expensive these days, and you have all those properties just sitting there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband wasn't even cold in his grave, and they were already eyeing his assets. You should give one of those properties to Clara, my father chimed in, as if it were the most reasonable suggestion in the world. What do you need 3 for, anyway? I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Are you serious right now? I asked, my voice shaking with rage. You skip Liam's funeral for a party, ignore me and Olivia for a week, and then show up uninvited to his will reading to demand his property? Now, Sarah, my father started, his tone condescending, there's no need to be selfish. You're alone now, but you have all this wealth. You should share it. Selfish? I repeated, my voice rising. I'm not alone. I have Olivia. And everything Liam left is for his daughter's future. Every penny will go to making sure Olivia has the best education, the best opportunities, the best life that her father can no longer be here to provide. I watched as my parents and Clara exchanged glances, their eyes flickering to Olivia with something that looked disturbingly like resentment. You're being ridiculous, my mother snapped. Clara needs help now, not some child who won't even need that money for years. Some child is your granddaughter, George interjected, his voice tight with anger. And her father just died. My mother's face flushed with anger. Don't you dare tell me how to treat my own grandchild, she snapped at George. We've been in this family longer than you have. And yet, you've shown remarkably little interest in being part of it, Susan replied coldly. That's enough, I said firmly, my patience finally snapping. Olivia, can you go upstairs to your room for a little while? Take Mr. Henderson with you to show him your rock collection. The lawyer, clearly relieved to escape the family drama, quickly stood and took Olivia's hand. I'd love to see your collection, young lady. Once they were out of earshot, I turned to my parents and Clara, no longer holding back. How dare you come into my house, days after my husband's funeral, a funeral you couldn't be bothered to attend, and demand his money. Liam worked his entire life to provide for me and Olivia. He battled cancer for 3 years, and in all that time, what help did you offer? None. You wouldn't even watch Olivia for a few hours. That's not fair, my father began, but I cut him off. No, what's not fair is that Liam spent thousands of dollars fixing your roof when it leaked. What's not fair is that Liam helped pay for Clara's accounting degree when you claimed you couldn't afford it. Well, let me make something perfectly clear, I will not be giving any of Liam's money or property to you. Not now, not ever. Every penny will go to supporting Olivia and securing her future. That's what Liam wanted, and that's what will happen. My mother's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything we've done for you. What exactly have you done for me, Mom? I asked quietly. Name one thing. One single act of selfless parenting. She opened and closed her mouth, unable to come up with an answer. That's what I thought, I said softly. I think it's time for you all to leave. The door slammed behind them, and I collapsed onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. You did the right thing, George said, his voice gentle but firm. Did I? They're still my parents, and Clara's still my sister. Biology doesn't make family, Susan said, sitting beside me and taking my hand. Love makes family. Showing up makes family. Being there in the hard times makes family. I nodded, knowing she was right, but still feeling the ache of rejection that had followed me my entire life. Later that night, after Susan and George had gone home and Olivia was asleep, I sat down at my computer and saw that my mother had tagged me in a social media post, heartbroken that my eldest daughter has become so greedy and selfish after her husband's death, refusing to help her struggling sister, even though she now has multiple properties and plenty of money. Material wealth has changed her. I stared at the screen, watching as sympathetic comments poured in from relatives and family friends who only knew whatever twisted version of the story my mother had fed them. Don't let Sarah get away with this. Family should help family. Poor Clara, always struggling while Sarah has everything handed to her. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced before. This was a new low, even for my mother. Trying to publicly shame me into giving them Liam's money. I took a deep breath and started typing. If my mother wanted to air our family's dirty laundry in public, then I would give the public the full, unedited version. I've been silent about this for too long, but since my mother has chosen to make our private family matters public, I feel I must respond. 3 days ago, we buried my husband, Liam, after his 3-year battle with cancer. My parents and sister did not attend his funeral. Why? Because my sister had scheduled a party to celebrate her passing the CPA exam on the same day, and they felt that was more important. For those who don't know, Liam helped my parents financially many times over the years, including paying for major repairs to their home and contributing significantly to my sister's education. Despite this, when I needed help during his illness, even just watching our daughter for a few hours, they were always too busy. Yesterday, they showed up uninvited to the reading of Liam's will. Upon learning that he had left me and our daughter financially secure, they immediately demanded that I give one of our rental properties to my sister because, and I quote, "she needs it more than some child." That some child is their 7-year-old granddaughter who just lost her father. I share this not to hurt them, but because I'm tired of being painted as the villain in a story where I've only ever tried to be a good daughter, sister, wife, and mother. Liam's money will be used for our daughter's education and future, as he intended. I hope this clears things up. I attached the screenshots I'd saved, including the message where my mother had said Clara's party was more important than Liam's funeral, and several texts where they declined to help during his illness. My finger hovered over the post button for several seconds before I finally pressed it. Within minutes, the comments on my mother's original post changed tone drastically. "Patricia, is this true? You skipped your son-in-law's funeral for a party? I can't believe you'd expect Sarah to give away property meant for her daughter. Those text messages are shocking. How could you say a party is more important than a funeral?" Calls and messages came in throughout the evening, relatives and friends expressing shock at my parents' behavior and offering support. My mother tried to claim in the comments that I was lying, but the screenshots spoke for themselves. Eventually, she deleted her original post entirely, but the damage to her reputation was done. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls from my parents and Clara. I blocked their numbers without listening to their voicemails. Whatever they had to say, I wasn't interested in hearing it. Over the following weeks, they tried everything to contact me, emails begging for forgiveness, but still subtly hinting at needing financial assistance, messages through mutual friends, even showing up at our house unannounced. Each time, I stood firm in my decision to cut them out of our lives. They're never going to change, are they? I asked Susan one afternoon as we watched Olivia play in the backyard. "People rarely do," she replied honestly. "Not fundamentally, anyway. It's strange. I always thought I needed their approval, their love. I spent my whole life trying to earn it. But now you recognize your own worth," Susan finished for me. "And you see that Olivia deserves better than to repeat that cycle." Update 1. 6 months after Liam's death, life had settled into a new normal. Susan and George continued to be fixtures in our lives, joining us for Sunday dinners and helping with Olivia's school activities. I had started managing the rental properties Liam had left us, finding unexpected satisfaction in the work. The properties in the city center turned out to be excellent investments, providing a steady income that supplemented what I'd put aside for Olivia's education. I also invested some of the money in stocks, following Liam's advice from years past. As for my parents and Clara, I occasionally heard updates through the family grapevine. They were struggling financially. Apparently, Clara had lost her job a few months after getting her CPA license. Turns out, passing the exam doesn't guarantee competence, and my parents were complaining about the rising cost of living. Each time, the messenger would awkwardly hint that perhaps I could help them out. My answer was always the same: "I'm sorry to hear they're having trouble, but my responsibility is to my daughter." Some called me cold or unforgiving. Maybe I was. But when I looked at Olivia, growing stronger and happier each day, surrounded by people who truly loved her, I knew I'd made the right choice. Update 2. One evening, about a year after Liam's death, as I was tucking Olivia into bed, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mommy, do you ever miss Grandma Patricia and Grandpa Richard?" I paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening her with adult problems. "I miss the relationship I wish we'd had," I said finally. "But not the one we actually had." She nodded, seeming to understand more than a child her age should have too. "I'm glad we have Grandma Susan and Grandpa George." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Some people would never understand why I'd cut my birth family out of my life. They'd never experienced the constant disappointment, the lifelong pattern of favoritism, the painful realization that some people are simply incapable of putting others first. But I understood. And more importantly, I'd broken the cycle. Olivia would grow up knowing her worth, surrounded by people who showed their love through actions, not just words. People who showed up when it mattered, who didn't put conditions on their support, who didn't see her as a means to an end. And that, I realized, was the greatest inheritance Liam could have ever given us. It wasn't about the money or the properties. It was about the freedom to choose our own family, the family that truly deserved us. And we had chosen well.